I'm Ram Ramaswamy, research affiliate in Professor Venkata's lab in the Brain and Cognitive Science Department at MIT. After graduating from MIT, I did a 1 year of fellowship, and then I worked in the magnetic recording industry, working on recording head design, development, and drive integration. Interestingly, magnetic recording heads are made up of layers of thin films. The electrical conductance of these films self-organize in response to the magnetic field from the recording medium and then produce a voltage proportional to the field. This is an idea of open system where there is interaction between two different systems, and the self-organization leads to determines the interaction process. After leaving the magnetic recording industry, I've been working in the area of brain research because I'm fascinated by how the human memory works compared to the magnetic recording memory that we folks worked on for many years. In the last few years, while working in Professor Venkata's lab, I've had the opportunity to work with many different professors from many different universities, and I've been fortunate to learn many different aspects of neuroscience and how the brain works. I tried to look at the brain as an open system from the type of knowledge that I gained from working on magnetic recording industry. The CRC meetings during the year 2017, I presented an idea that the brain is a reciprocal control and communication system, and the neuromodulators in the midbrain region of the brain produces communication signals which go up as bottom-up of feed-forward excitatory signals, and these show up as the EEG signals at 40 hertz or above, whereas the control signals are top-down feedback inhibitory signals, and they're less than the 40 hertz signal. So it's essentially looking at the midbrain as a control and communication system. That was the first thought. Then in 2018, I presented a model where I looked at the brain as an interface between the complementary parts of myself, which is the body and mind, and then the midbrain becomes an interface between the portions of the brain that control the body versus the mental cortex or the mind. Then in 2023, I extended this model to look at the process that underlies the brain architecture, and proposed that the self-organizing reciprocal process of control and communication could be the could define the human consciousness, and this is the reciprocal control communication process. In today's meeting, I would develop all these ideas into a general theory of interactions in open systems, and also formulate a mathematical model to describe this interaction process. A system is a collection of entities, but in the case of open systems, we're going to define it as two complementary entities, like what Igor was talking about. And these are distinct but interdependent. Okay, and they self-organize by interacting through an interface. That's what I want to focus on. And they exchange information, matter, energy with the environment, which in the case of living beings, it enables survival and adaptation. But the key thing is, in such systems, mass and energy are not conserved. There are no boundary or initial conditions. There is no equilibrium. There is only flow, right? Which actually makes it a very
difficult system to analyze. And the approach, what I want to discuss is that open systems should be analyzed as a progression of state changes. And within each entity that is interacting, the physical mechanism that is used is not really of importance, but it is the interaction that we will track through state changes. And the process by which they interact, and we define it as the reciprocal control and communication. It's a cybernetic process. And the key thing is the complementary entities interacting, they can be both observer-doer, if you're talking about a behavioral system, or they can be both observer and observed if you're talking about a knowledge system, and they can switch their roles. So this, and because of this type of interaction, there is no centralized control. And the question that you're asking earlier, so the way these open systems evolve is through nested dynamic interactions. That is, the interface itself breaks down into multiple interfaces, and each interface operates at a certain time scale. And over many time scales, they're interacting, and this nested dynamic interaction at various spatiotemporal scales. And then in the case of, I'm going to be talking about brain, the interaction actually happens as synchronized avalanche type emergent behaviors. That is, they're just spikes that are coming out as opposed to any sinusoidal waveforms type of things. So we won't be talking about the concept of frequencies, and it's all discrete digital series. Okay, so the example of an open system is myself. So I am body and mind at this instant in this world. So if we define that, we can see now right away, we have interaction between body and mind and the world, and any pair could interact, all three could interact, and within the body, there are a subsystem, there is a lot of activity going on. And you can see that essentially I'm a mess, okay, right? There's so many things that are happening, so much interaction going on. So how do we model this? This is the brain model that I've been working on. So you basically look at the body and the, maybe it's better piece of us. We have body and the mind as the two complementary entities. And in terms of the interaction, you can see that if the body is, when you're talking about body, a baseball pitcher, let us say, throws a ball at 100 miles per hour, that is like 2 inches per millisecond. That's the speed with which the ball is coming. And the catcher has to close the glove within milliseconds before the ball recoils and falls away. So there are events that are happening at millisecond scale time frame. Or if you're looking at the long range time frames within the mind, and while I'm speaking, the words are coming out at fractions of second, and then the sentences and all the other things, it goes over a longer time frame. And if you go even further, when you have a lot of individuals interacting together, you have the society, and the society itself can be thought of as a social brain. And that is doing lifelong learning, generational learning, and the social brain develops norms and values. So we can see that this interaction happens over enormous time scales, enormous amount of space. So how do we even understand this? And how does, in fact, what is there inside me that enables me to be able to go from millisecond timescales to lifelong timescales interactions? And that is what enables us to do is the brain. And the brain itself, therefore, must have a part that works with the body and another part that works with mind. You can just define mind as a portion of this brain itself structurally. But I won't go into this. So there is a perceptive domain and there is a knowledge domain. They are interacting, and they create self-organized maps and uses neuromodulators. And this is the kind of system. The key point is the goals of the interface is three-pronged: learning, memory and recall. That is what the brain is supposed to do. So that we'll talk about the process by which this learning, memory, and recall happens. So interactions could be analyzed by looking at an interface or building an interface that is capable of doing this learning, memory, recall. That's the key point that I want to make. So how does it relate to cybernetics? Actually, in fact, cybernetics is originally, when it was proposed by the pioneers of cybernetics, they all actually looked at brain. Norbert Wiener's book has, sorry, spelling mistake. His book has many chapters on brain. And I think Stafford Beer's book is called Brain of the Firm. And so essentially they studied the brain and put together this cybernetics process. I'm kind of going the inverse process here. I'm studying the brain and trying to understand it as a cybernetic process, okay? So in the cybernetic process, you have a system that is converting an external input into an action. But if it is not capable of taking care of all the mappings, then you need a regulator. And that is the model that Ashby has. But the key point he makes is the regulator should know all the requisite varieties, which means for all possible sensations, it needs to know all possible actions that can be taken. And this mapping has to be learned by this regulator. But in this case, when you make it that complicated, what happens is the regulator is not a simple device that is just doing feedback. It can become an independent entity by itself. And that is what is our mind. So that is why when I started off with my definition of who I am, I said I am both body and mind, two distinct entities, but highly interdependent and interacting. So that you can see the Ashby's model of regulation and the law of requisite varieties kind of fits into the architecture of interactions between complementary entities. So how would we go about modeling this? The points I want to make is, first of all, the relationship between the sensation and action, you have to understand it as a reflex. And that's what the brain needs to learn. And this is like an N by M set. That's what I was saying, large number of sensation and actions. And we are initially born bootstrapped with certain types of reflexes that we can handle, which we'll call the physical. That is, when the pain, the baby cries, right? And needs for food, it cries, and all kinds of initial bootstrap reflexes, but later on we learn very quickly. But that is what the body portion of it does. But then when we get to the mental portion, then it can take a new sensation and associate it with an old reflex, or it can take a new action and identify how it works with the previous reflex. And that becomes the associative memory sequence. And then the ability to be able to recall the knowledge from this experience. And that's what we are calling as language. So it's like a data structure database and a query language that constitutes the interface system. I'll just quickly switch over to the neuroscience side of it. Sorry, this one is going in between. I'll talk fast. The basic model that was put together by two Boston University professors is that there are two entities here, two interacting entities, E1 and E2. In the microcircuit of the brain, these are the two excitatory neurons, and there are two inhibitive neurons. So if you take the excitatory neuron, connect it to the inhibitive, and that goes and acts on the excitatory neuron, you get one path, and then you can get another path like this. But if you look at this model, right away you realize this is reciprocal communication and control. So even though they developed this as a circuit for doing phase lock loop, and that is what they defined it as this model, but they themselves realized that this really represents the process. The microcircuit in the brain represents the process by which it works. And essentially that process of reciprocal control and communication is cybernetics. And then in the case, even in E2, neither one, either one of them is capable of acting. That means you can have an external stimulus coming in and you can responding to that sensation as an action, or internally you can take a memory and turn it into a thought and produce an action that will give you feedback, a sensation, and that then drives the next thought process. So this is the reciprocal control and communication with the actors exchanging roles all the time. So this is the fundamental architecture. Now, instead of taking two nodes, if we take one node, a neuron can be thought of like a transistor. It is getting at the collector junction, it is bringing some input. There is a base junction that acts like a gate array, and then there is a output that goes through. And if you take two of those transistors and connect them to two RC circuits, one of it is a low pass, the other one is a high pass, then it does the differentiation integration, which is equivalent to what happens in the brain, in the image processing, like a pooling and a convolution. So this very simple cybernetic process is capable of describing the whole brain architecture. And the brain is the open system that we are talking about. And that this is the structural implementation that I'm talking about. In this circuit, and then in this circuit here, something very important. This is like a flip-flop circuit. That is, when this is conducting, this is charging and it is not working. And when this is charged, it shuts this off, and this is conducting. While this is conducting, this recharges. So they go back and forth. But depending on the circuit parameters, you can actually have a different duty cycles for this versus that. So you can have two different time scales you can concatenate, and this one process step has a certain time period. Why am I talking about this? Because this becomes the fundamental periods that you see in the brain. So when you go into the brain and look at different nuclei of the brain and look at the events that are popping, which is the spikes, sequences that are coming out, if you tabulate different regions and plot the time periods, you get things like 25, 40, 65. But if you divide one by the other, what you get is a golden ratio, which is 1.618. Okay, so this is a very interesting observation, and this is what comes out of the experimental measurements. And the justification that they gave in that paper is that they did an analysis of looking at a channel that is passing multiple frequencies. And if you don't want interference between those frequencies, then those frequencies, if you scale them by the golden ratio, they will have the minimum interference. So it is an observation from a natural system, and golden ratio becomes a critical parameter that allows scaling of going from in the nested interfaces that we have between the interacting entities. The nesting should be arranged. And what is interesting is this 1.6 is independent of any physical mechanism that is going on. So what we're learning from here is how does the open system evolve and scale? Okay. Now, is there any way we can produce a mathematical model to explain this? That's what I've been working on. A simple way to explain this is you can think of the interacting systems. This is one part, this is the other part. That is, this is the environment that is giving discrete Poisson input. And this is this system under study. And there is a physical mechanism that is going on inside here. And that could be modeled as a continuous exponential process. So if you're talking about how to analyze the interaction, you can take the interaction as from the world, all kinds of discrete input coming in as a Poisson process that beats against the system that is just continuously evolving like as an exponential process. Mathematically, you can show that when these two interact and when the rate parameters match, then the output of this system is another Poisson input, but it is also a geometric progression. This is the mathematics behind it. So if the parameter for the Poisson is lambda, and the parameter for this that is the matched parameters there in the first stage, what would happen is the second stage would evolve as a geometric progression with the rate parameter 1 plus lambda. So the scaling between these two is 1 plus lambda over divided by lambda. And what is interesting about it is if you substitute lambda as the golden ratio of phi, 1 plus phi is phi squared divided by phi is phi. That means the successive stages scaled by golden ratio, and I can keep on duplicating this. And since the statistical process doesn't change of discrete versus continuous interaction, the successive stages are scaling by golden ratio, which is the observation we saw in the brain rhythms. When it's an explanation, a statistical explanation. The last thing. How do we understand the interactions? So in the case of brain, a very beautiful statement was made by Professor Raymond Gallery. What he says is each message, if we call it as an interaction, each interaction must be related to the anticipated action and its sensory consequence. This is the fundamental rule for interaction, how the interface should be designed that is studying the interaction should see this. What does that mean? So every time I have a sensation, I'm going to be doing some action in response to that sensation. So Sn leads to Mn plus 1. Okay, that is called the reflex operation. Then the second part, that is, it's not just the anticipated action, but the anticipation action should lead to a sensory consequence, which means the interaction between the previous motor action with the sensation should give rise to a new sensation. So you get Mn plus 1 and Sn plus 1. These are not really arithmetic operations. These are actually mapping functions. So what these two statements imply is the interaction could be studied by a two-step process, which is reflection and recursion. Okay, that recursion is association of memory. And that in the very first slide, I was saying what the mind does is it takes some primordial reflexes, and for a new sensation, it says, oh, this is the reflex that should happen. Or for an action that it took, it says, oh, this is the reflex that it is going to result. And those sequences, they're called operant conditioning and classical conditioning. And that leads to associative memory. And that associative memory can be sort of mathematically expressed in this form. Now, if you take those two equations, you can represent it like in a matrix form. Don't get hung up on serious mathematics and multiplication here. This is really a mapping, topological mapping operation. So I can take these two equations. Mn plus 1 is 1 times Sn, and Sn plus 1 is Mn plus Sn. But what is very interesting about that matrix is its eigenvalues are the golden ratios, and its eigenvectors are created by the golden ratios here. So whether you start experimentally measure it, or you use the statistical approach, or you use this reflex recursive operation, you seem to kind of run into this golden ratio as a magic scaling parameter between successive stages. Now, the successive stage, you can study it either as a time scaling, that is, in which case you're taking information and you're chunking it, and how long it is taking between successive stages. That operation, that timing, it comes out of golden ratio scaling, or you can also look at it as populations of neurons. That is how much inhibition excitation that is being applied. And the population also scales by the golden ratio, and they go in opposite direction. One of the things I didn't say in the original brain slide is when it goes through reciprocal communication control. Well, anyway, I don't want to go into details. Sorry. Okay. Okay, last equation here. So if you take this equation, which is the associative memory, what the associative memory says is, okay, the last sensation resulted from the previous action on the previous sensation. But by recursion, this itself is mn minus 1, sn minus 1. And then sn minus 1 is mn minus 2, sn minus 2. Now, if I drive it down all the way to the first sensation, now we can express this as the latest sensation is repeated actions of motor actions acting on the initial sensation. So what this simple statement implies is the mental memory that I need to have needs to contain only the actions that I'm going to take. In fact, I cannot do this. The last line. You cannot do sensation sequences at all. That cannot be stored in the brain, because sensation is converting analog energy, light, sound, or pressure to create electrical pulses that cannot be stored. Only thing the brain can store is which portions of the neuron should be activated, or which muscle should be activated, how long and how strongly. So this very simple recursive reflexive operation shows that the mind is a sequence of motor memories, and this equation, this statement can be mathematically expressed in this fashion. So to summarize, what I'm talking about is an open system, which is interaction between complementary entities. And the entity, one of the entity could be just the environment, because if the two entities are sitting far apart, it can come through the air and you can get the interaction. And that is the discrete Poisson input that I'm talking about. While that interaction happens, you're changing. So, but in order to study the open system, you need an interface. And the key requirement for that interface is it should be capable of learning, memory, and recall. And the recall is the language. In fact, the neuronal language that I talked about, these different time frames, they essentially map into verbal languages. That is the time periods that I talked about, the gamma, theta, and delta periods. They are the time intervals through which we create phonemes, syllables, and words. So they all kind of fall very nicely into each other. The neuronal language that happens inside the brain is the basis of the verbal language that the human beings created. Thank you.